I'm delighted to welcome up to the stage our first set of panelists. And I will introduce our moderator, and he will introduce you to the folks who are serving as resources on the panel today. I'm happy to welcome Casey Gerald, who is co-founder and CEO of MBAs Across America. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I think I've got a microphone. Yeah. Good morning, y'all. I hear there was a lot of barbecue and bourbon last night, so we'll try to be entertaining for the people who are falling asleep. I do want to recognize one of our panelists who cannot be with us this morning due to an illness, so we'll send her our thoughts. Gracia Martinez Rosas is the Deputy Executive Director at United We Dream. Originally from Hidalgo, Mexico, Gracia immigrated to the U.S. with her family at an early age and grew up in Dallas, Texas as an undocumented immigrant. Gracia has organized immigrant youth and workers for the passage of pro-immigrant policies at the local and national level for the past 10 years. She's an extraordinary leader and champion and change agent, and we hate that she can't be with us, but in your time afterwards, definitely track down her and her work. I understand it's been a fantastically inspiring week, so you might not totally be aware that the world is still a mess outside. I saw the first thing this morning was an Instagram post. A high school student, and she was at a protest, and the sign said, "Why are we studying for a future that we won't have?" So I think that is the context in which we have Liam and Samson to help us answer that question and give some sense of where to go from here. Liam O'Doherty is the Director of Digital Youth Engagement Programs at TakingITGlobal. He designs and implements initiatives to inspire, inform, and involve young people in making a difference in their communities. With a background in sustainable development, communications theory, and theatrical improvisation, which maybe we'll get to, he has extensive experience in advancing youth rights, gender equality, inclusive design, and climate change initiatives through a range of contexts from grassroots mobilizations to international policy processes. Samson Itodo heads one of Nigeria's foremost youth think tanks on democratic governance and citizens' participation, the Youth Initiative for Advocacy, Growth, and Advancement, which is a youth nonprofit promoting democratic governance and youth participation in Africa through research, capacity development, and policy advocacy. They've won plenty of awards. They come highly praised and recommended, and I think they'll leave us very inspired. I understand that yesterday was a lot about your personal narrative, your public narrative in the spirit of sort of Marshall Gantz, the great teacher. So I thought maybe we'd start there. You all are working at the intersection of ginormous issues with very important organizations under your helm, but I know this is very personal work for you. So I'd love if we could just start with, why in the world are you doing what you're doing today?
Do you want to start? Should I?
Go ahead.
Okay. I do the work that I do because I get to work with amazing people, and I get to move forward with them to create a better world. And that's really exciting and engaging and fun work. It's not always easy, but bringing people together and building commonality and understanding what we need in order to make the world work better is, I think, what is needed in the world. And so to be able to see a need and respond to that is incredibly rewarding. And as our agency and our ability to affect change gets bigger and bigger, those rewards become bigger and bigger. And seeing the influence and the feedback loops of what working together across radical lines and working with people who don't seem to have much in common with you in the first place is incredibly amazing work, and has led to a huge amount of experiences and practical outcomes, which I hope has improved a bunch of people's lives.
One question, follow-up question to sort of double click on that. Was there a moment when you first got on fire for the issues that consume you now?
One moment that I remember was in grade 3. there was a movement in my city to amalgamate all of the different suburbs into what is called a megacity. And I remember asking my teacher if I could get up in front of the class and explain why I didn't think this was a good idea, and how decentralizing and moving like the boundaries and having decisions that would be made for the city happen outside of the city was not a good thing. And I remember just thinking that's an odd thing to do, to get up in front of your class before a math test and to like make an emotional plea to my comrades who are like in grade 3, because they don't have power or decision making in this. But that moment is one that I look back on and think about, that started this kind of cascade of trying to advocate for things that I felt were just and right.
Mm-hmm. Samson.
Thank you. Good morning, and thanks for inviting me to speak on a very important issue, excuse me, around movements, and just to talk about my story. First, I come from a continent where over 60 to 70% of the population is dominated by young people. And whilst we are in a demographic majority, we're a political minority. And the average age of African presidents is about 65. And that's the youngest continent in the world. And every power bloc in the world is interested in Africa. And for us as young people on the continent of Africa, we believe that leadership has been the bane of our underdevelopment. But we can't say that young people are demographically in a majority, but led by people who are actually on the way either to their graves or they're actually retiring from politics. I come from a continent where when they say you're a youth leader, you're somewhere at about 60 or 70. And we've got a tradition of recycling of leadership. So people who were military dictators 10, 20, 50 years ago are still in electoral politics. And we felt very, very disenchanted. But part of what I do and working with young people across Africa is how do we disrupt the political space? And for those that I've interacted with over the last couple of days, I am a disruptor. And I believe in changing the business of public governance as well as politics. And we've got to get young people who have content and character into the room. And that's why working together with other young people in Africa, we started the Not Too Young to Run campaign, which is reducing the age for running for office. So we get young people to the center. Because democracy cannot deliver developments to the people if the people who are in the leadership, people who are in public leadership, do not provide the necessary capacity and competence that is desired. And young people do have competence, young people have character, and young people have the capacity to take Africa to the next level. And that's what I do in Africa. That's my story.
That's great, that's great. When you said you're a disruptor, I thought of what Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, says. He says, if you want to understand the entrepreneur, the social entrepreneur, study the juvenile delinquent, because what the delinquent is doing with their behavior is saying, this sucks, I'm going to do my own thing. Yeah. Was there a moment for you, 7-year-old Samson, gets kicked out of school or something for disrupting? And I ask these questions because so often we meet people who are at the helm of these giant movements. And the thing that keeps them going, winning that Nobel Peace Prize or whatever, is the same thing that got them in trouble or got them noticed when they were 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And so I often try to figure out what was that initial spark as a human being before you became.
Yeah, so I was a student in the university, and as a student, I'm not sure in your countries, perhaps in some African countries, where student union governments are banned because of the role that students actually play in galvanizing and articulating student rights. And you can't talk about human rights when you suppress the voices of students. Students who don't have access to quality welfare or infrastructure within universities, they pay their fees, And then why don't we have access to quality water, or our hostel accommodation is like, where students are subjected to very dehumanizing conditions. And when student leaders speak, they are asked to either shut up, or some of them are rusticated. And we thought, this cannot continue. This was not the society that we ought to inherit. One of the things we always hear, and my brothers and sisters from Africa would understand is, our parents would tell us, oh, back in the days, this was not the case. We had it all good. We're coming out from the university, the jobs are there waiting for us. And we thought that, no, then where did we get it wrong? And we have to take action. So for us, rather than, and there are two approaches to change. You can either be revolutionary or reformist. You can be a mixture of both. One is about altering the balance of power in a very radical manner, which is a revolutionary approach, and one is reformist. I am a mixture of both. I have protested before and been arrested and kept behind bars for 2 days. I don't. That's not what I'm saying that you have to do. But that's my own story. But we can still get change without being negatively disruptive. So I think it's important to qualify the disruption that I'm talking about. It's about positive disruption that engenders change, because you can disrupt and not get change, because change is concrete, change is specific, and it's important that for we who are organizers and movement builders, we understand these dynamics of change in our engagement.
I love that. We'll come back to this revolutionary reformist thing as we continue. I think a lot about, we're here to talk about movements. There's that great, very short TED Talk, How to Build a Movement, and the guy is dancing on the side. Has anybody seen this? It's like 2 minutes. It's great. Watch it today. And it's a guy that's dancing on the side of a hill. And the speaker is saying that the most important thing in building a movement is getting the first follower. And the whole video that he's showing and talking about is this guy dancing, and the most important thing that happens is one person comes and starts dancing with him. And then everybody else on the side of the hill comes and dances. But that first person took a long time to get it. How do you think about getting, as you build these movements, as you build your organizations, as you do your work, how do you think about getting that first person on board, and then how do you go from there?
Well, excuse me. 5 things that are very central to building movements, and I'll end on how to get the first person. First, as we approach organizing or movement building, we must approach change from a standpoint of a process. That change is a process and not an event. That understanding needs to be deeply appreciated, because what we see with organizers across the world is we focus on activities. We come to change or organizing from a point of activities. The second is movements are driven by principles and values, because these are basic fundamentals before you start thinking about organizing or getting the first person. Movements are about principles and values, because movements are simply a collection of people who are involved in collective action and driven by a common identity. The third is about relationship, and which harps on the point that you make about getting a person. In movement building, relationship is king. And that's why I love the session yesterday around telling your stories, the public narrative, and you talk about martial gangs. First is, how do you assess the person's emotions to mobilize their resources that they have, and then convert it to the power that they need to get the change that they want. And first is, we talk about, there's a difference between movement building and mobilization. Mobilization is not value-based. And so if you're going to be engaging or mobilizing anyone into your movement, focus on the values. And that's why it's important for us to know who we are organizing, who we're mobilizing, get to know them, get to know their values, and then engage from the point of values, and not because you want them to support a particular activity or a particular cause. Even if they're doing that, let that engagement be based on values. So when they connect with those values, it becomes the resource, or it becomes the source harnessing the power that you need to actually engage. So it's very important. The third is around structuring leadership. And leadership is very, very key. And I know we'll talk about that. But before we start talking about getting that one person into whatever cause to support whatever cause we're involved in, it's important to answer these questions. And that is where movements actually fail. Because we don't spend time to think about these values. We don't spend time to think about ideals, norms, and standards. And so we get people on board. And when people come on board and they discover, oh, it's just an empty shell, it dissipates energy and they turn back.
Yeah. How do we get our first followers? So one thing I like to think about, first we invite them and we find out what do we need in order to make our movement, our dance, accessible to them? What do they need and what's in it for them to join us? In the case of the video, I mean, dancing is fun and people have a good time while doing it. And so I like to think about how can we make our movements via the stories that we tell and how we talk about ourselves and how we conduct ourselves, how do we make that magnetic so that people want to join us because it looks like we're having a good time, and probably because we are. And obviously, this work isn't always fun, but it can be meaningful as well. And so either by presenting a good time or presenting a meaningful outcome that is going to enrich our lives and move our societies forward, I think these are the things that people look for and that they cling to, because there's so much information in our world today, but I think we struggle for a lack of meaning. The other thing that I like to think about is I'm not as fond of the kind of like follower leader mentality, and I'm more around collaborator and co-conspirator. And instead of having someone, follow the dance that I'm doing, I want to learn their dance and I want to dance with them and engage in what they do. And that helps to build leaderless movements and very resilient horizontal frameworks, which I think are stronger and more capable in terms of implementing change in the long term.
Absolutely.
Actually, before we move on, I want to touch on this because one of the big questions is, in some ways, it's almost an obsession with the word movement. Yeah. Sometimes I used to tell people all the time, go change the world, and then a decade passed, and now I tell people leave the world alone. I mean, relax a little bit.
Absolutely.
In a way, there is such a rush to claim I'm building a movement,
yeah,
which is value neutral, perhaps. How do you think about, I'm going to build a leaderless movement versus I'm going to be the chair of an organization that has committees and, initiates, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, I'm assuming it's not an either or, but do you have any thought or guidance around, I've got this problem in the world that is really pissing me off, and I want to do something about it. Now I can go out and I can, go to a protest, I can start a leaderless movement, whatever that means, or I can start an organization, a traditional NGO, and raise resources and have a board, and et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about when somebody comes to you with this burning passion, giving them some direction as to how to move forward?
You go first.
Samson, you seem to be anti-movement.
Okay. So, if someone comes to me and with this problem, the first thing I would harp on is the 4 dilemmas that organizers face when they want to start a movement. And the first is around bounding an organization, which is in the domain of whether you're going to be inclusive or exclusive. Because one of the dilemmas we face is how do we define those who are actually members of our movement? Because the moment we determine who is a member of a movement, we're also defining who cannot be a member of a movement. So we're faced with this dilemma of inclusion versus exclusion. Mm-hmm. It's very, very important because any movement that does not have commitment or obligations cannot generate the kind of strategic capacity or social capital that it needs to get the change that it wants. So for movements that are communities without obligations cannot be very, very effective. And so you're going to be grappling with people coming in and out of that particular organization or that particular group. And it's not whether you have bounded as a group, but it's whether, as having bounded, you've generated an identity that everyone who wants to be part of that movement actually shares. So we always have this dilemma. The second is actually in the domain of organizational creativity, where we deal with when do we expand or when do we limit ourselves? Because you find a situation where when movements begin and they are successful, it changes things like resource configurations, leadership, as well as the energy that you need. And you now have situations where you're grappling with, do we maintain this small organization or we need to expand? And this can actually be addressed either by building, synergy, constructive synergy within the team, as well as you're going to start having fragmentation within the team. So these are things that actually needs to be addressed. But to build on, I'd like to end on this note. When we talk about movements, just like we say that there is no universally accepted definition of a movement across the world. But there are three things that are distinct about movements. One, it's about identity, and they're involving collective action, as well as people. So it's about people. So when we talk movement, it's people, identity, and collective action. And that is what movements do across board. So you need to have that clarity, and which Liam talked about from the world goal, and that will define how, as a movement, you lead. But to end on, because this issue dwells largely on how you structure your leadership within a movement, whether you call it leaderless movement, or movement with leaders. And tied to this is actually a structure. Sometimes as leaders, we're grappling with, do we want to have a very formal or flexible movement that isn't a coalition? Because when a movement becomes a coalition, there's a difference between a movement and a coalition. Coalitions are probably sets of organizations who are working together, and they've got a very definite structure. It's got its own pros and cons. You can adopt that if it works for you, but for movements, it's about people, and that's where the aspect about relationship and identity comes to play. But don't forget, in talking about movements, it's about people, it's about identity, it's about collective action.
Mm-hmm.
One way that I like to think about this is starting an organization is a little bit like starting a band. Whereas starting a movement or joining a movement, because I'm not sure necessarily that movements can be intentionally started as opposed to realized from understanding a common goal or a common threat. A movement is a little bit more like an orchestra or a symphony, except without a conductor. And within that broad collection of people making noise, different pockets of those folks can come together to play on the same key or play in the same time signature and hopefully make something that's worth listening to. But I see movements as much more cacophonous, much harder to control or steer, and focused more on that kind of relationships and commonalities, whereas organizations can be created in many different ways, but they usually have a structure and someone who is ultimately going to be responsible. Often this is the founder at first, but then there can be succession. But usually organizations have some kind of formal government structure and constitution or laws, and usually more hierarchy. Whereas most of the movements that I've been a part of, you just say, hey, we all care about climate, what can we all do? And what we're prepared to do, what we're capable of, what our skills, what we're able to bring to that movement is going to be much more organic, probably a lot noisier, but you can make a lot more noise with an orchestra than you can with a band.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It makes me think of, I was having dinner a few weeks ago with friend of mine who was one of the first protesters in Ferguson, Missouri, in the Black Lives Matter movement in 2014. And I asked her, what's the state of the movement these days? And she said, well, is there even a movement? You never get that answer if you ask them, what's the status of Take It Global? Well, is there even a Take It Global? This is again, it's value neutral, but it's a different challenge. Let's talk a bit about scale, which I feel like every donor wants to talk about and no leader wants to talk about. The first year, we ran a pilot of MBAs Across America, which was basically kind of a domestic Peace Corps for business students. And we had a great time. We thought it really worked. And I went to a business school professor of mine and I said, all right, Lynn, it's time to scale. And he said, but you don't know anything. I said, what do you mean? He said, you don't know. You've done one summer. It was fine, but you don't know anything. He said, more importantly, you don't scale programs. You scale answers to questions. So go figure out what your questions are, and then we'll talk about whether you have the right answer. Can you talk a bit about, one, how you think about the question that you're trying to answer in your work, and two, how the answers to that question have changed over time?
One of the questions that I see as central to my work is how can we create a better world and a better community together? And I feel like the different angles and different approaches and different issues that come up for me have changed. I started as an environmental activist and a sustainable development activist, and then got more into like gender rights and accessibility rights and indigenous rights. And so as these movements and different issues have come up for me, the way in which we approach these questions, the way in which we frame our goals changes and evolves over time based on the people who I'm associated with and who I'm working with. The question, I think, becomes much more context-based as I've evolved and moved forward in my movement building, because the question that we're trying to answer is answered differently in every single context that we work in, because every community, every individual, every theme is responded to differently. And so the vocabulary, the resources, those are all going to be different. And so I think it becomes much more nuanced. And I'm now more satisfied with many different answers, because I know that the answer can't be the same for everyone, because we're not the same. And so being more comfortable with uncomfortableness, and also being more uncomfortable, or being more comfortable with just difference and different answers has evolved over time.
Yeah, so how do you scale, and what should be the preconditions or considerations for scaling? I completely agree with Liam. It has to be context specific. What are the issues? There are some issues that are localized, and even though an issue is localized, again, one of the dilemmas that movements also face is, should we have a national goal but local action? How do we connect our work at the local level with what happens at the national level? But if you dig deep and you look at structures, the more localized a movement is, the more hierarchical, the more oligarchic, and the more exclusionary it becomes. And that's why it's always important as we scale, we're very clear about what's the purpose, what's the goal of scaling. Is it to expand the scope of our impact, or to build our leadership competencies and capacities, or to connect with other movements who are doing great work just to draw strength and solidarity? And I'm pro-solidarity. And I think that in whatever we do, and when we think about scaling, we should also think about solidarity. How do we strengthen and deepen solidarity amongst ourselves, whether at the local level or at the national level or at the international level? It's a huge source of I would look at scalability as a source of generating more power as a movement to get the change that you want.
One more thing to add here. So when I think about scaling, which I largely just think about growing, there's two general ways of scaling that I understand. One of them is scaling vertically, which is basically doing what you're doing in more locations with more people. And then the other way is scaling horizontally, which increases your own capacity to address the challenges that you're working on. Yeah. And at certain points, the efficiency of just scaling vertically reaches a limit. And looking at new ways and new ideas and methods for implementing that change is necessary after a while. So at a certain point, I think it's really important to revisit some of the presumptions about how you're going to grow and think about how you can address the challenges in new ways that make your job easier in the first place as an organizer.
That sort of calls to mind a question that's on my mind often, which is sort of, and is troubled by this push that I think both of you all are making in very important ways that also reflect what change making looks like in a different way, which is to sort of reduce the profile in a way of a charismatic leader. To sort, the generation that sort of taught us to do this work, it's like it's one person, they go to the deal, they give the talks, they get the whatever, But at the same time, Samson, you do a lot of television. Liam, you're a digital media, expert. How it is a gift and a curse if you're going to scale horizontally, expand capacity, raise awareness, you have to use the tools of media. How do you think about doing that in a way that gets the message to the most people, whether it's on Instagram or Twitter, or whether it's on, local access news or CNN, right? Which Grace also does a great deal of. How do you navigate doing that, using the tools of media that are unprecedented, while one, not falling into sort of, hashtag activism, or falling into being a, celebrity?
So,
which I guess you're already a celebrity, so it's too late.
No, come on. First is, I think that for we who are organizers and community organizers in this room, over the last few days, we've talked about leadership. We need to see movement building and organizing as a leadership practice, which is simply taking responsibility for enabling others to achieve a common purpose. The underlying concept is taking responsibility. And it's not viewing leadership as organizers from a standpoint of a position or an individual, but to look at leadership as a way of life, even for members of your movement and those who you recruit. Because what movement is about leadership recruitment. So anyone who is a member of your movement or your organization, they need to come to that movement or to that organization viewing themselves as leaders, because leadership is not a position. So as community organizers, we don't see leadership as a position, we see it as a way of life. And I think that understanding informs the way we structure our movements. And Marshall Gangs will call it the snowflake model, which is rather than being dependent, you adopt an interdependent model where we all consider ourselves as leaders. And so everyone has a critical role to play. And so we're depending on each other to get the resource to achieve a common goal or objective. If you've got that understanding, you know that it's about the people and it's not about yourself. So usually identity is an issue that movements deal with. So if you look at South Africa or you look at the liberation movements, oftentimes people talk about Nelson Mandela, but they forget that there are also other leaders in the movement. You have Walter Sisulu, you have O.R. Tambo, even Winnie Mandela. If you look at the civil rights movement, everyone talks about Martin Luther, but there were other leaders in the movement. And that is why we who are taking responsibility as leaders will have to be very, very intentional in our engagement, not to create the impression out there that it's about us. So in our decision, and that is why when you're structuring leadership, you need to set norms from the word go. Even though, norms actually evolve But you need to set those norms. And once you do that and everyone has got a commitment, they see themselves as leaders. So they don't wait for you to take a decision before they get to act. And that is why when you look at movements across the world, that's why the whole concept of collective action generates that power. So even when you're engaging with media and the press, be them social media or using hashtag, yes, and this sometimes is controversial, but the truth is, yes, hashtags are a tool for mobilization, but they are not necessarily change that we seek. It can be, so oftentimes we come to technology as an end, but not a means to an end. What it does, it helps galvanize people. But yes, galvanizing or organizing people can be a goal, but it's not change. If your goal is to change a particular policy, the fact that you trained on social media, you've got 1 million followers, if at the end of the day that policy is not changed, then I don't think you've achieved anything. And so we need to go beyond that to get in change, because change is concrete and change is specific. If your goal is simply get people aware, yes, it's very good. Everyone can actually get people aware. And if that's your goal and your objective, fine. But we need to go beyond that, especially when we're involved in community organizing. Sure.
One thing that comes up for me on this is before, and in my past, I was looking for a way to amplify my own voice, to find a way to reach more people with my messages. And now I see my work as finding the people who, finding other people and amplifying their voices. And there's much more nuance in that. And so I see part of my role in terms of how we use media as finding many different voices that are all saying the same thing in slightly different ways, and finding ways of improving the efficacy of spreading those messages to their respective bases. It's less of a one-size-fits-all approach and more of a flotilla, or like, again, using that metaphor of the symphony, wanting everyone to be more adroit and more capable of playing their instrument, as opposed to getting everyone to follow what I'm asking them to play.
Sure. That calls up the question of metrics and measurement. Well, I want to start with you, Lynn, but I want to start with something that Samson said, which is that at the end of the day, X, Y, Z. A big question is, what's the end of the day? You know. I mean, you take something like climate change. What's the end of the day? In some ways, I saw someone that was speaking after the church, after Notre Dame burned, and a climate activist said soon after that, so hearkening to the original folks who built the church, and they said, we'll never see this thing finished, but our great-grandchildren will see it finished, and so we'll go to work today to do that. And this climate activist was saying that climate activism is a bit like that. Nothing we do today will be realized fully in our lifetime, but if we don't do it today, it will the consequence. So how do you think about measuring the work you're doing now and then communicating that to people who are expecting to see some tangible result? Because you take, for example, the Occupy Wall Street movement, for example. You could say at the end of the day, if you measure the end of the day by 2012, nothing happened. But if you look at the fact that 2 of the leading presidential candidates for the 2020 race are running basically on Occupy Wall Street themes, then you have a different end of the day. Not saying that they succeeded, but it's just a different context. So how do you think about measuring something as nebulous, overwhelming, depressing, hard, complicated?
So the end of the day for me is the end of the story that we're telling. And those stories are going to change, obviously, based on the context. It's really interesting to take on issues that are much bigger than we can possibly hope to solve in one lifetime. But I feel like every challenge that is worth solving is bigger than ourselves. For me, it splits into qualitative and quantitative, and also inner and outward metrics. So just how do people feel about being a part of this movement? Do they feel their own agency? Do they have a feedback loop so that when they take an action, they get some kind of positive or negative response and can verify whether or not that had the intended consequence or something else? There's also like hard metrics for some of our movements, like the percentage of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And so that's an important thing to keep your eye on. But in a lot of ways, some of those big external metrics are beyond our control. And so I like to focus on what are the outcomes of the things that we're doing right now, and how do the people in our movement feel? Do they feel supported? Do they feel like they're getting anywhere? Because if they feel good, then they'll continue. And if it's very frustrating, there's a challenge there to be overcome. And part of this is just the stories that we tell to ourselves. Sometimes something that is a failure can be reframed as having unintended consequences that we couldn't have seen coming, like ripples on a pond, in ways that we could have never anticipated.
Well, thanks, Liam. Reflecting on what you said, how do we measure impact? There are different tools to measure impact, but I won't dwell on that. Movements do three things. They meet, they take action, and they celebrate. Now, all these are opportunities for renewal. As you meet, you're asking those questions on whether our goal is achieved, and we get to reflect more on those goals. There are marginal gains, there are marginal wins. We celebrate those wins because it inspires members of the movement. Oftentimes, movements, there's some movements that don't like to celebrate. They want the macro change. But there are marginal gains, and we were, for those who participated in one of the sessions Aaron did over the week, and it looked at the ladder. The same way you've got that ladder, there are turning points in that particular movement or advocacy effort that you're involved in. Even if it's just securing a meeting with a particular public official who has, shut his doors on campaigners or advocates, just even having access to that meeting and laying and advocating your issues is something that is worth celebrating. And when you celebrate that, it inspires members of the movement because they are seeing results. But is there ever going to be at the end of the day? Sure, there will. And one challenge that we have as organizers is we don't know when to call it quits. So even when we achieve a particular goal or objective, there's always the desire to continue. That's a dilemma you would face because you've built so much social capital. There are people who are so energetic and they want to keep going. Yes, whilst that is good and it's fine, but my dear brothers and sisters, there are times that we just call it quits. We've achieved our objective, everybody go home. If there's another issue, we can organize around that issue again. But until we get to that point and looking at relationships and dynamics in society and the fact that we live in a very unequal world, I don't think there's ever going to be that at the end of the day.
End of the day, yeah. I too am inclined to keep going, but I'm going to temporarily call it quits to see if we have questions from folks. And I hate to do this, but I am not going to, the first question is going to come from a woman because we don't have any on the panel, which breaks my heart, and hopefully we never have panels like that. But.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, we're going to take a quick, we're not going to hear from another man for a sec. There you go. No, I want to take your question, brother. I just want to be sure we're not so gender balanced. Yeah, so male dominated. Yeah. You had a question? Go ahead.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Can we get the mic right here, and then we'll come right back to you. I'm sorry. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was really, really fantastic. My question is specifically to you. I want to ask you, you mentioned how we need to actually stand as leaders within these movements and within these capacity building exercises we do. We have to stand on the shoulders of other giants. So we look at Nelson Mandela, but we don't realize that he stood on the shoulders of great giants. So we see him, but we didn't see the giants underneath him, who are an imperative part of not only the movement he was a part of, but also in order for him to rise, there had to be those that were on the ground. How do we make sure that within these movements, we are constantly feeding the soul and the energy of those giants, because those people are greatly needed. But sometimes within these movements that we see the world over, we do see that figurehead and we see that one person, and then the entire world wants to be just that one person, and we don't remember, or we forget that that one person didn't just fall there. They got there with the assistance, guidance, and often the greater leadership from others who made sure that they pushed that person forward. So how do we build capacity on the ground to make sure that we're building giants who are not only going to be in the forefront, but are going to be the men and women on the ground?
Thank you. Thank you. Somebody want to take that?
Okay, I thought we'll take a couple before we respond.
What's that?
I thought we'll take a couple.
Oh, sure. That's great. Yeah. We'll take a couple questions and we'll let them respond.
Kwaku from Côte d'Ivoire. I'm the founder of Corruption Quitte Ma Cité, that is a youth platform where we teach servant and ethical leadership and also teach principle of governance. And I would like to talk about the scalability concerning money, because most of the time it's very difficult for us to scale up. When I take my case, for example, when I have to organize some conferences, I use my own salary, because fighting corruption is very difficult. When you find partners, finding fundings, people even escape you because you are fighting corruption. So how can we make sure to get access to grants and funding to scale up our work?
Great question. Thank you. Yes. Can we get the microphone right here? No.
Good morning. My name is Joshua. I'm from Uganda. So my question is, most of the time when we listen to stories of leaders that lead movements, there's always a painful story behind them. If you talk of Nelson Mandela, his story, we all know that he was in jail. If we talk about even just people who are in the civic movements here, they are doing what they are doing because there's something that maybe they face and they feel like they want to change it. So in most cases, when we are leading these movements based on like our stories, there's a group of people that we normally leave out. And this is a group of people who were privileged enough. They never went through what we are going through. And when you talk about the pains we've had over time, this is not something that concerns them. And yet, they have the influence that we need so that we can rally together and achieve the goal that we want. So my question comes in like, how can we influence these people? How can we inspire them that they will be able to join the movements? And possibly also that, how can we raise a generation of people that look at themselves that the privilege I've had is someone who never had this privilege, and I want to fight for them. Because we not only just need people who will lead us because they had a pain in their life and they want to solve it. We also need those ones who had the privilege, because the fact that you had the privilege means you have the experience also to help others also enjoy what you enjoyed. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a lot of,
Okay.
I think there's some things. Yeah, Samson.
Thanks, Joshua. Let me start with this. Colleagues, as community organizers, one of the mentality that we must not hold on to is the savior mentality. I think what has killed movements over the years is individuals thinking they are actually saviors and they're going to liberate the world and they're liberating people. Liam talked about agency. Yeah, and that's why when we understand leadership as taking responsibility and not a position, and we tell those people that they are leaders and they've got the power to exercise agency over their own future within their own community, we might change that, that sort of thinking. Because let's not abdicate, let's not encourage citizens to abdicate their responsibilities to us. Let's empower them with the information and the capacity that they need to lead the change. That's how movements are sustained, and not about the individuals. The second point is around money for scalability. I'm sure even hosting this meeting required mobilizing resources and bringing all of us together. And in a space where the donor space is shrinking, money is always going to be a challenge. There are innovative strategies of doing that, but I would say that for those of us who are community organizers, yes, money is important, but can we put people first? Can we focus more on the people? And there are several resources that people do have that does not actually require money. They can generate, number is a resource. There are technical resources that people do have that they can convert to the power that they need to get the change that they want. Going for advocacy visit or protest, yes, sometimes it requires money, but if you check even the Black rights movement and the protests across the world, models are shifting. Organizations are not procuring T-shirts for people to come out to protest. Rather, they ask people, okay, if we're wearing yellow today or red, please can you grab a red shirt and show up for this particular meeting or protest. We just need to think about innovative way of financing movements, and this is not a platform to talk about that, but we just need to come to this with a different attitude. Talking about this intergenerational engagement between former leaders of the movement and present day. There is a movement here in the US, I don't know if it's the Black rights movement or Black Lives Matter. They've got this ideological construct around 7 generations. So it's an ideology that what we do today is connected to what 7 generations before us actually did. It's connected to that struggle. Therefore, as we organize today, we're also building 7 generations ahead of us. But to make this happen, we need to document our stories more. One of the greatest disadvantage or the sad part of movements is we don't spend time to document the contributions of women and persons with disability in organizing. So when we tell stories, we're only telling stories of the men and the idol. So we need to be very intentional. And we who are the new generation or these new order organizers, we just need to change the way business is done. So if we're going to be telling stories, as we organize on our daily lives, and yesterday we were taught the value of journaling, as we document these stories, let's also document the stories of women and persons with disability and put the information out there. It does help to create that repository of knowledge. So 5 years, when people look at 2019 or 2018, they've got resources that they can leverage on.
One thing that comes to mind in responding to these questions is the power of questions, because questions can present a space for the people that you're asking the question to fill in for themselves. And a couple of questions that came to me in thinking about how to answer to your questions. Who is not being heard in this movement and why? And how can we amplify those voices? How can we make our movements more accessible? What do we need to do to get people who are influenced by this but might not be showing up at the table? Who is negatively impacted by this issue? And how can we present being a part of this in a way that will benefit to them? Like corruption, for example. There are probably many companies in your country that are subject to corruption, would see that as an inefficiency and that they're being hurt by that. And they have something to gain by eliminating or reducing the amount of corruption. And so finding someone who is already on the receiving end of that negativity and telling compelling stories and asking the right questions so that they can come to the table with what they have, I think works very well. The other part that comes to mind is the difference between doing things for somebody else and doing things with somebody else. And I much prefer to do things with folks, because otherwise I'm perhaps making assumptions and doing things that I shouldn't be doing. And if we bring along people, we're much stronger and we can tell better stories to more people.
Daenerys Targaryen should have had you all in her advisor pool. Do we have any other questions? Yes.
My name is Talen from Zimbabwe. I have a question for Sam and Liam. In relation to evolvement or evolving of movements, particularly looking in the African context where student politics, for instance, is compared in previous times and what's happening right now, how do movements evolve? And also looking at political parties. Most political parties are one-party states in Africa, and they associate with people who fought the liberation struggle or made the countries independent. Mm-hmm. And young political parties or emerging parties do not have that identity. So the evolvement of movements, what can you talk about that, and the comparison between present movements with similar themes and movements from the past?
One thing that comes to mind when we look at how do movements evolve, and in my opinion, movements evolve by continuously and iteratively aligning themselves with changing contexts. Our world continues to change and continues to move, and it's important for our movements to see the change and figure out how we can chameleon and change ourselves so that as the context changes, we change to match that context. So one thing that comes to mind, and this is almost like a trope, but like the internet, we now organize digitally. And so that has changed the way in which our attention spans come, the level of interactivity that we expect from our movements. But if we don't continuously ask, what is the context and the environment, and the context is also the people, what is the context and how is that changing, and how can we change ourselves in order to be effective in that context, then we're not speaking the right language that we might need to in order to move ourselves forward.
I think the way the society and the world is structured is every citizen is a born activist. Because you wake up every morning, you're advocating for one issue or the other because we're fed up with the way our society is structured. And so you're going to always have that quest for a better society because man naturally cherishes progress and prosperity. If you look at the movements of the past and now, I just think that context for organizing 10, 20 years ago is different from today's context. And you talked about technology, that's, but even demography. If you look at population shifts, that is also one issue to reflect on. My thoughts will be that we just need to connect these movements, which harps on the earlier point I made, around we need to invest in doing research around these movements, and that's why I appreciate the one of the sessions a few days ago that brought the images of founding fathers and those who had led struggles, because it helps us as a new generation to think about our history, and history is very, very important. And for us in Africa, we need to invest in history. But also look at even our academic institutions and how are they platforms for political socialization and citizens' empowerment. A lot of the leaders within the African movement, a lot of them were positively radicalized permit my word, positively radicalized in American institutions like Howard University. If you look at Kwame Nkrumah, Nnamdi Azikiwe, and co, they all had opportunities to understand human rights and civil rights in these institutions. So it's very, very important. But we must also know that there's a difference between movements, political parties that can be movements in their own respect, than movements that are simply driven by whatever ideologies that they have. And I just want to end on this note, and I'll go to Africa. I'm sorry I'm Africanizing this conversation, but because that's where I come from, so yeah. So there's a country in West Africa called Gambia. I don't know how many of you know Gambia. Now, Gambia had a dictator called Yahya Jammeh. who had ruled the country for several years and refused to relinquish power. And 3 years ago, there was an election, and he lost in that election, and accepted that he lost. And so a few days later, he refused to accept the outcome of the election and said he didn't lose the election. And there was so much chaos because before Yahya Jammeh's exit, it was very, very difficult. Gambia was a closed state, and people were declared persona non grata and couldn't go to Gambia. Gambia is just like Rwanda of today, that is highly policed. You can't go to conduct research or even ask questions about how government is performing. And what happened was, after these presidents refused to relinquish power, there were just young people who just said, you know what, we've got to organize. And all they did was to send out a tweet that Gambia has decided, and because Gambia decided at the polls. And it was just that one tweet, Gambia has decided, that became a rallying force. And other Gambians started organizing, and people were using the tweet, the hashtag Gambia has decided, and it was time for Yahya Jammeh to go. It was that assertiveness on the part of those young people in Gambia that made other regional institutions like ECOWAS ensured that Yahya Jammeh left power. That's also the story of the Bring Back Our Girls movement in Nigeria. That's the story of the Not Too Young to Run movement. That's the story of the Fees Was Fall movement in South Africa.
Right. Yeah, well, that's a great, one last question just to close. Coming back to that Instagram post, that was very depressing. These are huge issues that will take lifetimes to solve, questions of how do you, heal from trauma, avoid going broke, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's hard work that all of us are doing. What are one tangible thing that you do to maintain your joy?
I play a lot. I think about the work that I do as play. And I also go back to the question, what can I do today to make what is currently impossible more possible tomorrow? And as there's incremental progress day by day and meeting by meeting and interaction by interaction, what becomes possible gets bigger and bigger. And that's one of the things that keeps me going.
Awesome.
What keeps me going is simply just looking across Africa and seeing young people ask difficult questions. It just gives me hope. And that is why I'll continue to do what I do every day.
That's awesome. Well, Liam, Samson, thank you so much for your work and for your wisdom and for being with us today. And thank you all so much for your questions. Let's give them a hand.